بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. أهلا وسهلا بالجميع، وإن شاء الله ينضمون لنا أكثر في أمسية جديدة من أمسيات إجراءات العمل اللي تقيمها كل شهر ES Consulting. وكما عودناكم دائما في كل أمسية نناقش موضوع مهم يهم العاملين والعاملات في مجال الإجراءات. نعرف في مجال عملنا سواء في توثيق الإجراء أو تحسين الإجراء يتطلب الكثير من التحضير وإجراء المقابلات من أجل أن نفهم الإجراء في وضعه الحالي ونحوله للصورة أو الوضع المأمول. إنما تخيلوا معي لو ما عندنا وقت إلا إحنا نطرح سؤالين فقط علشان نفهم الإجراء في وضعه الحالي. يا ترى إيش بيكونون هذول السؤالين؟ هذا اللي اليوم بناقشه معنا خبيرنا واللي أنا فخورة أني أناديه زميلي السيد روجر تريغير. روجر, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Martha, and good evening to you all. Thank you for to talk about some aspects of my favorite topic, and my thanks to Consulting for making this possible. So let me tell you something about me before we get started. Perhaps I've met some of you, there's a good number joining us, but if we haven't met before, then I spend my life talking about and thinking and consulting and writing about business process management, or as you'll hear me call it, process-based management. I've been doing that for a very long time with lots of organizations around the world. You'll see some of their logos there on the screen, and you'll recognize some of those because I've been doing lots of work in Saudi Arabia for many years now. But there's quite a range of organizations there. There's large organizations and small ones, public sector, private sector, organizations with different organizational cultures and different national cultures. And all of the things that we talk about in this webinar have come from or are being used in those sorts of organizations. So it works across all sorts of types of organizations. So it's a general philosophy, a general approach to management through managing our processes. So that's what we'll be talking about here. I've published lots of material, and you can find most of it on my website. And in the various columns I write at BP Trends and other places. So I work all around the world. I've worked in various ways in 15 different countries through my career. So I have partners in those areas where I do work. In America, in Africa, of course, through my good friends at ES Consulting, ES Learning, and IB, in Saudi Arabia and the Arab states generally. It's been my privilege to work with ES since before it existed. I first met Bassam Al-Qarashi, must be 14 years ago, when he attended a course that I was delivering in Sydney. In India, Q3 Edge is my partner, and I also have partners here in Australia and New Zealand. And I'm right now somewhere under that big red dot down in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen in Australia. I live in a small village called Bungendore, which is just near Canberra, the Australian capital. So we're about 30 kilometres from Canberra, and if your Australian geography permits, that's about 300 kilometres southwest of Sydney. So that's where I am, and very pleased to reach out across the world to you. Before we go on, I just want to tell you about an exciting new project we're just starting in Saudi Arabia. You will know about Alula. So we're just starting a project with the Royal Commission for Alula. And it's the classic process-based management project where we'll start with strategy and build process architectures, and then think about performance, about KPIs and governance, and we'll start putting that into motion. Of course, we can't travel at the moment, so I'll be here in my office in Bungendore, using some pretty clever technology, of course, but dealing with people whose job it is to create this living museum out of the ancient sites of Alula. That's a very nice kind of juxtaposition. I'm looking forward to getting started on that project that we're doing, just starting now. So that's an example of the sort of work that we're doing, and it happens to be right in your part of the world at Alula. So the thing that provoked this webinar series was my recent book, Process Provocations. Process Provocations was published. The content of the book is a series of posts that I've did for a long time on LinkedIn, and then each one of those has turned into a page in the book. And by the way, this book is available in English for now on my website as a free download. So if you find my website, it's tregearbpm.com. You can download a copy of the book for free. And my friends at ES are also in the process of translating this into Arabic. And we look forward to having that available sometime in the new year, in 2021. I thank them for that. And the whole thing will be available in Arabic. So what we're going to do throughout this webinar series is just to take some aspects, some particular pages. Each page of the book is a different topic. It's meant to be a provocative exploration of some aspect of process-based management. So we're going to take some aspects of that in these webinars and work our way through. And in this session today, we'll be looking at the page 32 of the book. In fact, 2 questions for every process. That's the structure of what we're doing. So this is the page of the book that we're at. And we're really looking here at coming to grips with other ways of really understanding what a particular process is about. You know, what does everyone want from this process? We don't have any unimportant processes. And if we find an unimportant process, we probably should stop doing it. So we've got all of our processes are important, some are more critical than others, of course, but when we're looking at a particular process, you know, what is its reason for existence and how could we make it better? Do we need to make it better? What do the stakeholders want out of it? How can we make sure that it's working at just the right level of performance, of efficiency and effectiveness? What can we do to really ensure that the process is working as everyone wants it to? Or maybe we can't make it work as everyone wants it to. Maybe that's just not a realistic expectation. But we should know that, shouldn't we? We should know if our process can't be improved to everyone's satisfaction, because at least we have to deal with that problem. Okay, so before we get to that page, though, I want to just briefly walk through my approach to BPM, to process-based management, so that we know how I'm thinking about this and the general framework of how I think we should all be dealing with and managing and improving management. And I'll also use the term BPM, and I mean the same thing by that. I tend not to use the term BPM as much these days because it has lots of different meanings for different people. You know that. Some people think it's a management philosophy, and others will think, you know, it's a piece of software, or it's about automation, or it's, you know, so it has lots of different meanings. So it's a bit confusing. But obviously, I do use the term. You can see that in the bottom right-hand corner. It says Tregear BPM, not Tregear Process-Based Management. That wasn't going to fit on the logo. But when I say BPM, I'm always meaning the same as I mean with process-based management, and it's defined in this definition. So it's about the continuous management of all of our processes, and those are the processes by which we create, accumulate, and deliver value. And we're doing that to give ourselves the best opportunity to mindfully improve process performance. So we can target, there are hundreds, if not thousands of processes. We can't improve them all. So we need to understand which are the ones in which we should invest our time and effort. So it's continuous management backed up, enabling continuous improvement. So this definition is kind of bookended by those two very important concepts. And most organizations are doing some form of continuous improvement. It may not be, as continuous as you'd like, and maybe the improvements aren't as great as you expected, but someone in the organization is always trying to make something work better. That's just a natural thing for people to do. And I think we can do better than that. And one way of doing better than that is adding continuous management, because not enough organizations are doing that continuously, consciously thinking about the processes, making evidence-based decisions about which processes we should even analyze, which processes should we improve. Pretty much all of our processes could be improved, couldn't they? But which ones should we invest in? We have, at least hundreds, if not thousands, depending on how deep we're digging into the architecture. So this is what I mean by process-based management, and everything on this slide shapes everything that I say about how we should do process-based management in all of our organizations. Another important concept, cross-functional value delivery. This is fundamental to process management and improvement. Now, this is something most of us haven't done for a while, of course, but we remember how to do it. If we're taking a flight, we check in, we board the plane, complete the flight, we retrieve our luggage, we hope, and we depart the airport. Now, if I asked you which of those 5 things needs to go well for you to say, I've had a great flight, I know you'd say all 5. And that's perfectly reasonable, isn't it? There's no point in having a very fancy check-in if when we get to the other end, our luggage didn't. That's not going to be a great flight. Or even if we had check-in, we got the upgrade, great flight, on time, luggage was there, but then we had to wait for an hour at the destination airport for a taxi. That's not going to be called a great flight either, is it? So what we need to do is think about, and airports and airlines and everyone involved does think like this these days, we need to think about that as a group of sub-processes of the process, let's call it relocate traveller. And what we need to think about, and it's what the traveller certainly thinks about, is that the customer journey, the literal journey in this case, it's going to be from home to hotel, or hotel to home, or hotel to hotel. It's that whole thing that has to work well for us to say we had a great trip. And this kind of cross-functional thinking applies in all of our organizations. There's no one process in the organization that does everything. It's always a sequence of processes coming together to create some value. So each of the 5 processes here in Relocate Traveller needs to work well, of course. But perhaps more importantly, they need to work well together if the customer value is going to be actually delivered. And that's also good for airlines and airports too, isn't it? I mean, it costs airlines a fortune to find lost luggage. That's a very expensive thing to do. And they put a lot of time and effort into try and minimize the amount of luggage that gets lost. And to be fair, it's a very small percentage, but it's still a very big cost for them around the world. So it's in everyone's interest to think about this, not just as the 5 separate sub-processes, but as the combined higher level process. So cross-functional thinking is very important in all of our work in process. And it takes us to this, I call it the primacy of process, and I think it's the most important principle of process-based management. And it says this, it says that there are 2 perspectives, 2 views of every organization. We've got the vertical or functional organization, and we also then have the horizontal or process organization. Now, in this vertical direction, it's mainly about managing resources, and the key artifact is the organization chart. So this is the functional organization. It's the org chart. It says who reports to who, and where the authorities are, and where the delegations are, and how we group people of like objectives and like skills. And none of that changes in my world. Everything we say about process is an addition to that. We still have an organisation chart. We'll still have all of that vertical reporting. That's important. However, we know that we create, accumulate and deliver value to our customers and other stakeholders across the organisation. You know, someone does something, some other group does something else, someone does something else, and eventually we're able to deliver something outside the organisation. There's no box on the organisation chart which by itself could deliver something outside the organisation. So it's just not the way organisations work. So we need to have this horizontal view as well. We need to correct our horizontal vision problem by thinking about the process organisation. And the key artifact there, of course, is going to be the process architecture. And by the way, when we say we create, accumulate and deliver value through our business processes, that's the same as saying that's how we execute strategy. And that's important thought, isn't it? So it means process isn't just something that's happening, you know, at the front counter or in the office cubicles or in the factory. You know, this is strategically important. Cross-functional business processes are the only way in which an organisation can execute its organisational strategy. Therefore, it is the sort of stuff that needs to be taken into account at the executive level. We need to make that very clear to executives in our organisations when we get the chance that this is executing their strategy. So that's the primacy of process. That's a fundamental principle that we need to keep in mind in all of our process work. If I give a process-based management presentation, if I could only have one slide, it would be this one. If we can get this message across, then everything else flows from that. As we can say, we spent a lot of time managing up and down the organisation chart, but who's in charge across the organisation? Whose job is it to make sure all of those pieces come together? Well, maybe it's nobody's job. The organisation chart certainly doesn't define it. It's all about up and down, and we work across. So we need to have some overlay on our management operations to correct for that problem. So how do we do that? Well, this is a simple model, simple but I think profoundly effective model of how we can create this continuous process improvement engine. It's a sort of meta model for management generally. And I've built this over many years, many projects. It's come out of many projects and I use it all the time now and it works very well. So we have two circles, the PO circle and the PI circle, process ownership circle and the process improvement circle. Now, when we're thinking about the operation of the circles, we're thinking about an individual process. And it could be a large process or a small one, doesn't matter. Any process at all, we can apply the circles. So here we go. We start with the PO circle, and it's got three nodes: target, assess, respond. Target, assess, respond. I think this is the drumbeat of process-based management. Target, assess, respond. What do we mean by each of these nodes? So target, we're setting performance targets. These are process KPIs. So what are the KPIs and what are the targets for each of those KPIs? And we're talking to our stakeholders. We're saying if this process was working as well as everybody wants it to, what would it be doing and how would we know? Simple questions, sometimes not so easy to answer, but we need to know, don't we? We need to set performance targets for our process. And then the next node around there is assess. Now we're doing several things here. We're certainly assessing current performance. How is the process performing? And we're deciding whether there's a gap there that's that we need to do anything about. We're also assessing not just the performance, but what about new ideas? What about the whole innovation thing? So the KPIs might be all okay. The process seems to be working well, but are there new ideas, new technologies, new ways of thinking about the process, which would enable us to do it in a different way and perhaps a better way? So we're doing two things at assess. We're assessing performance and we're assessing ideas. So it's about performance management. Our KPI is 9.5 out of 10, and we're currently getting 9 out of 10. What are we going to, should we do anything about that? What are we going to do about the performance gap? But also idea management. Perhaps there's an opportunity gap. Perhaps there's something else we could be doing that would improve the process in a useful way. And then we're going to move to the respond node. And of course, if we're not responding, then what was the point? So we need to, we might do three things at respond. Firstly, we might decide that we don't need to do anything. Everything's fine. KPIs are okay. We don't need to review anything. There's no new idea to test. So everything's fine. Nothing to do here. Move on. We might, and we should occasionally say, we better review our KPIs. Maybe just because they haven't been reviewed for a while, or maybe because we need to take into account some change in the circumstances of the process, or it might just be that we've got a KPI and we keep measuring it, but for the last 3 times we've measured it, it's been the same number. Well, if our target, if our KPI is now turned into a constant, then we don't need to measure it, do we? It's not a valid measure. The other thing we might need to do here at Respond, though, is to have some intervention into the process because there's a performance problem we need to investigate, or there's a new idea we need to test. So that will trigger the PI circle. Now, the PI circle is any process improvement methodology that you want. It might be Lean or Six Sigma or BP Trends, or it might be, probably much more likely for you, to be Sprint Pip, the process improvement methodology that ES Consulting, originally Bassam El-Karachi and ES Consulting have developed, which is a fantastic method, would be my choice as well. And it came out of, interestingly, it came out of the idea that perhaps we should improve the process of process improvement. So whatever method you're using for improvement, this is shown here in the PI circle in the most generic sense. This is current state, future state, and what is it we need to do to create the new current state. So as is, to be, and to do is the list of things, changes we need to make to create the new as is. Because creating a new current state, of course, is the purpose of process improvement, isn't it? Far too often process improvement projects seem to stop after the 2B presentation. We come up with a list of changes that we want to make and everyone agrees with them, but perhaps sometimes they don't actually happen. And I think it's that we don't keep going. We stop after we've defined the changes. We don't go on and actually make them all. So these are the circles, and I'll talk all the time about getting the circles turning. The PO circle turns all the time at whatever speed is appropriate for the process. So if it's happening once a day, then it turns once a day. If it's once a month, etc. It's however often we can collect performance data. So we're testing that all of the time. So the process owner and the PO circle is really defining the process owner role. They're all the time just testing to see what's going on with the process. We trigger the PI circle when we need to investigate something, a problem or an opportunity. We whiz around that, we run the Sprint Pip, and then we make the changes. And all of the time, PO circle keeps turning, so we always know how the process is performing. And that lets us, of course, test whether the changes we made a difference. Sometimes we don't know. Maybe it might be obvious, and maybe the changes might happen quickly, but some of these changes take months, not days. So, did we really make the change as we expected to? Okay, so get the circles turning is what we're always talking about, and as I say, the Sprint Pip. Sprint Pip is the method that you would use there most likely. Certainly working with ES Consulting. And it came out of a desire to improve the process of process improvement, to apply our own theory to our own work, in a sense. Now, in addition to that, what we're going to talk about here, the 2 questions for every process, this is all about saying, what else could we do to really build a richer understanding of what the process is about? And I call these 2 techniques wiggle and wobble. I'll explain in a moment, but WWGLL and WWBLL. It's too hard to say, so I always think about this as wiggle and wobble. So we're going to add some wiggle and wobble to our process improvement analysis. Let me explain that. So wiggle, what would good look like? That's what the acronym is. What would good look like? It's a simple question, but we're just saying, we look at the process, whatever it is, big one, small one. If this process was working as well as it could, what would be happening? How would we know? What would the stakeholder be experiencing? Forget about how it is working now, but what would be the extreme case if it was working really well? If everyone was delighted, what would be happening? That's a very good conversation to have with a range of stakeholders. Forget about what it's doing now. Let's think about it's almost like saying, what would the perfect process be? Perfect is a pretty demanding standard, but what would it look if it was really good? What would be happening? How would what would it feel like? What would it look like? What would people be experiencing in all sorts of ways? So we might have conversations. Let's use this particular process as an example. So we're just thinking about a recruitment process, recruit employee. And as you see there, this process is being defined as everything from advertising, the original advertising of the position, through to interviews and various sorts of assessments. We make an offer and we finalise a contract with the new employee. So everything from advertising through to finalising the contract. So we would have conversations with, there are many stakeholders in this, aren't there? There's people in HR, but there's also hiring managers. There's all the candidates, there's successful candidates, unsuccessful candidates. So anyone who's a stakeholder, and we would have done our normal stakeholder analysis to define who they are. That's an important thing to know. So what sorts of things might come out of that? Well, people might tell us that it would be really good if it's completed quickly and there's no wasted time for anyone. So just things happen, there's no delays. Wouldn't it be terrific if in our process we only got good candidates applying? The best candidates. Perhaps, in the ideal case, we only have one candidate who would apply and they were the very best person on the planet for the job. Well, that's probably not going to happen, but just having good candidates apply would be nice. Maybe it would be great if all of our offers were accepted. We might go through this process and make an offer to someone to join and they end up not accepting. Well, there was a lot of waste in that, wasn't it? And also, what are we going to do? We're going to go back to our second or third choice? That's probably not ideal. So, okay, there's another attribute of what good would look like, that all our offers were accepted. And we want everyone to be happy. So these are just some examples. I mean, you don't sit around and make them up. You actually go and talk to stakeholders and ask them what it would feel like, what it would look like, what would happen, what would be the consequences if this process was working really well. So this is wiggle. What would good look like? Okay, now we can also go to the other extreme. So let's imagine for this process, again, forget about how it's working now, but if we were looking to design the worst possible process, now that's a strange idea, isn't it? And hopefully we're not going to design the worst possible process, but it's a nice thought experiment. What would the worst possible process look like? What would be its characteristics? And again, what would stakeholders be experiencing if it was like that? Let's look again at our original same process about recruiting an employee. So we're talking about recruiting employees, same one, everything from advertising through to finalising contract. Again, we'll have lots of discussions. What would be the worst things that could be happening? Well, they might tell us that candidates get to have a little bit of a look inside the organisation and decide it's not a place they want to work. So the organisation exposes itself, doesn't it, when we're doing a recruitment process? It may or may not be a correct impression that candidates are getting, but they do get an impression of us. We might get swamped with poor quality candidates. We run the advertisement and we get 100 responses, most of which simply aren't qualified for the job. there's something going horribly wrong there, because that's a huge waste of time. We presumably have to do something with every application. So it's going to take up a lot of time for us to do that. So that would be a very poor outcome. We don't get first offers accepted. We end up too often making the offer to our second or third or perhaps fourth choice. We go to all the trouble of interviewing and selecting the very best people, and then we can't employ them because they don't want to for some reason. So now we're working our way down the list. So if we were more often than not employing people that were our second or third choice, that doesn't sound like we're building up good capabilities in the organisation. So we need to, that would be a poor outcome. Of course, if there were lots of delays, some stakeholders might say that would be very frustrating. It would be costly. It might contribute to poor acceptance rates. All sorts of things might go wrong. So I'm just using these as examples of what we might do if we're really asking our stakeholders to think about, what would bad look like. And we hope, having described what bad would look like, we hope that's not a definition of the current state. But we want to understand that, and what we're doing here with both Wiggle and Wobble is trying to really get a more nuanced, a richer understanding of what this process is all about and what makes it work well and what makes it work badly, and what the stakeholder experiences are in being part of the process. And then we have to understand where we want it to be. I mean, there's a spectrum here. We've defined it now. What good looks like, as good as it can be. And we also said what it would look like if it's as bad as it could be. But where do we want our process to be? We might, the immediate reaction might be to say, well, we want it at the good end, of course. But there's a cost for being at the good end. Cost for being at the bad end too, but to improve the process near to some level of perfection is expensive. So we need to make informed decisions about where we want it to be. But now we've established the range of experience, haven't we? We know what good looks like, we know what bad looks like. And now we can get some sense both of where we are at the moment and where we want to be. And if we decide where we want to be, then of course we can reasonably easily beyond that decide how we're going to get there. What are the steps we've got to do to make that change? So it's an important question to decide about every process. What is the performance level where it's as good as it should be? There are three things we worry about for performance, isn't it? We know how it is performing. We know how it should perform because that's our KPIs. So we've got a performance gap there, perhaps. And then there's a third thing about how it could perform. What ideas might we come in? So our process performance is something that we're always trying to look at. And this is what the PO circle is trying to do. It's trying to balance how it should perform, how it is performing, and how it could perform. So we're looking at that overlap of is, should, and could. And it's a bit of a moving target. So we always want to make sure that we're making the adjustments so we've got some optimized level of performance. But the optimized performance doesn't mean perfection. Sometimes we're a bit too quick to say, we want 100% achievement, or we want 0 defects. And perfection is a pretty tough standard. If the average performance of your process is perfection, then you've got to build a pretty good process. Now, some processes, of course, need that level of performance. I always use this example of a process that delivers children home from school. What level of performance? Would 98% be okay? Well, probably not. What about 99%? No, we only lost 10 children in the year. No, I think we probably have to say we want to be 100% effective on that process. But if we're going to do that, then we need to get very specific about making that possible. when we set KPI targets, they're not just general aspirational targets. We mean to achieve them. So in any process where you've got 100% or zero as the targets, then you need to make sure that the process is going to achieve that. So for the bus example, what happens if a bus breaks down? How do you know the child got off at the right place? The right child got off at the right place. How do you know that? How do you know? How do you make sure it can't happen? So we can define what good looks like. We can define what bad looks like. That gives us a range. Then we need to make some informed decisions about where we are in that range and where we need to be. What is the business case for getting presumably closer and closer to the good end? And we need to make good evidence-based decisions about that. So what should we do? I think we could all easily add wiggle and wobble to whatever process analysis methodologies we do. It's easy to do. It's kind of a thought experiment, isn't it? You do it with a flip chart or a whiteboard and a bunch of stakeholders. It's pretty straightforward, and it's an interesting conversation that you can have with your stakeholders, and it lets us understand more deeply what stakeholders want. Perhaps it helps the stakeholders understand what they want as well. Because I'm sure you've had this experience. You identify people who are obviously stakeholders in a process, but they really don't seem to understand that. And they seem surprised to discover they're process stakeholders. So, we get a deeper understanding of what the process is all about and what the various people involved in it need from it. Then we can understand the performance extremes, as it were. And that's always an easier thing to do, to say, what are the extremes? What would it be doing if it was working really well? What if it was working really badly? And then that gives us a range perhaps across 7 enablers to actually understand what we need to do. And then we can, if we're identifying things that delight stakeholders and then things that dismay the stakeholders, then obviously we can take action to encourage the delights and avoid the other, so that we just give ourselves the best opportunity to optimize process performance from everyone's point of view. And of course, when we say stakeholders, I always include the organization itself in that, the people that are delivering the process, who are executing it, running it. It's not just about customers and external parties, it's also about internal parties. So that was they're the slides that I wanted to go through, and I'd be happy to take your questions and comments. As I said before, we have, if you go to my website, and Moz has given you in the chat that the URL for my website. If you go there and it's under, I think it's called Knowledge Resources or something, you'll find it anyway. One of the main items, and you can download that book, only in English for the moment, but when we come sometime early in 2021, we'll have it in Arabic. But you're welcome to that anytime now as well. So if you have some questions, I'm happy for you to go off mute and just ask me, or if you want to type them, that's fine as well. We've got some time here to answer your questions. While you're thinking about that, one of the questions that I'm often asked when we talk about process architectures and process-based management, people ask, where should we start? And I'm sure the starting point has to be to define a process architecture. That's what we do in all of our projects. And then the question is often, how long does that take, and what's involved? And people are often surprised that it doesn't take, well, I mean, in one way it takes forever, because an architecture is always going to change. It doesn't ever, it's not finished at any time, because continuous improvement means it will continuously change. But it doesn't take forever. when we do this, it varies depending on the organisation and the complexity of the architecture, but it's usually done, well, usually back in the old usual, when we could travel, when we were doing this on site, we would do it in perhaps lots of 2 weeks. We'd have workshops each day for 2 weeks, lots of other meetings and discussions in the afternoon, workshops in the morning. Then there'd be a gap of maybe 2 or 3 weeks, and then we'd have another 2 weeks. And at the end of all of that, we've got a process architecture down to 3 levels. And that's probably, I don't know, it depends, but 250, 300 processes perhaps. And we would have done some work on process KPIs, and we would have selected a small number of processes to start the circles turning. So we'd have process owners appointed and detailed KPIs, and we'd be collecting data and get that going. So, it's an elapsed time of maybe 2 or 3 months and a much smaller amount of actual workshop and project time to get it going. Of course, that's just the start. It's not the end. I mean, you get to the point then where you've got a viable process architecture, and the circles are starting to turn for a few processes, and everything's coming together to be able to get the circles turning and to start doing some mindful management, some of that continuous management that will lead to better continuous improvement. So what else can I tell you? Questions? You must have questions that I can help you with. Okay, so Mona asks, if the organisation doesn't have any documented processes, should I document the as is and then improve it during another phase, or should I improve it and document it once it's done? Great question, Mona, thank you for that. So it's really about saying, what should we do about the as is? Now, some people will say, don't worry about the as is, because that's what we don't want. What we want is the to be. So let's not fuss about the as is. Let's just go straight to improving it, because we know we need to improve it. Okay, I understand that. But I think, for any journey, there are 2 things you need to navigate, aren't there? You certainly need to know where you're going to go, but you need to know where you're starting from. And if you don't know where you're starting from, Google Maps is not going to do anything for you if it doesn't know where you are. So we need that for any journey. We need to know those 2 places. And I think we really do need to understand the as is, the current state, because we need to know how it works. We need to know what's good, what's bad. Okay, people say we want to improve the performance of the process, but what does improve mean? So sometimes people will say, oh, it takes too long. Okay, how long does it take? We don't know, but too long. Well, we do need to know, don't we? Because if it takes 5 hours now, 4 hours and 55 minutes is faster, but that's probably not the sort of improvement people had in mind. And then do we need it to go from 5 hours to 5 minutes, or 5 hours to 3 hours? Because that's a very different project. So I think we do need to do lots of investigation of the as is, the current state. But there is a limit, of course. You can spend your life modelling and understanding the current state. It's fun to do, it's easy to do, you don't have to make many decisions. It's a very comfortable thing to do. But if you stay in the current state forever, you're not going to make any change. Of course, you're just going to learn more and more about the process, but you won't improve it. So I think, for me, I need to start at the as is, because I want to know where we're starting from. Then I'll work out where we're going to go to, and then we can plot the journey. But you don't want to, if you spend all your time planning the journey and not making the journey, then, that's not what you started out to do. Okay, so let me see. You've all woken up now. We've got a bunch of questions flooding in here. We have a question. Do you think conducting fact-finding is a good tool to answer the 2 questions? Well, certainly it all needs to be fact-based, doesn't it? I mean, we really do need to get the facts, evidence. So, when people say, as I said just a moment ago, when people say, oh yeah, what's wrong with the process? It takes too long. It's too slow. Well, Okay, but we need to understand what that means. And maybe nobody actually knows. Maybe the data is not recorded, and maybe we've got to go and get it. Maybe we have to take some time and actually record the data. How long does it take? And we don't just want one number, do we? And we don't just want an average. We want to know the distribution. You know, what is the nature of this? And maybe a process takes longer at some point of the day or the week or the month than at other times. So we need to understand, we need as much data as possible. So another question about how does Six Sigma help control the process? Well, Six Sigma would fit, the DMAIC cycle would fit nicely into the PI circle, of course. And it's a process improvement thing, and maybe some aspects of some implementations of Six Sigma, Lean Six Sigma, perhaps might flow over into the PO circle. But mainly Six Sigma is the process, is a process analysis and improvement technique, and it would fit very nicely right in with the PI circle. It's an instance of the PI. So Ida asks, how can I prioritize a process? There are method or tools to do it. Well, I think, you know, so firstly, prioritization is important. And I think we need to step back and look at a whole process architecture. A process architecture is going to have at least hundreds of processes in it, but probably thousands if you get down, you know, below, I mean, just down 3 levels, it will have generally 200 or 300 processes. Below that, you know, it turns quickly into thousands. We've all learned in the last year, haven't we, the real meaning of exponential. So we know how things take off, and that's going to happen as we go down and down further into a process architecture. So we're not going to manage even hundreds of processes, not actively, seriously manage. It's certainly not thousands. So we're going to pick high impact processes, they're often called, or the key processes. And you might be surprised that most organizations, even large complicated ones, end up defining maybe it's 20 or 30, some number like that of high impact processes, and they're the ones that they seriously manage. Okay, so we come down from thousands to hundreds, and now we've got, let's say it's 30 processes that we're going to have in active process management. The circles are turning. Well, how do we prioritize what we're going to do in those? Well, if the circles are turning, the PO circle is going to tell us, isn't it? It's going to say, hey, here's the performance gaps, here's the impact of the gap, here's some ideas. Is there a good business case here? You've got to particularize that to the organization to say, you know, what the impact means. But I think it's evidence-based. You know, where is the best return on process? I think that's what we've got to be doing. How can we calculate process? How can we? How can we process capability and performance with limited data available? Yeah. Well, if it's really limited data, then you can't. You know, I mean, we can't make it up. The data, anyway. If we don't know, if there is no data, then maybe we have to just start finding the data. And if we can't, if you say, well, no, but we can't get that data, then you've got the wrong KPI. You know, a KPI for which we cannot collect data is meaningless. And if you're going to say it's the right KPI, but we can't get the data, well, the process is just random then. We just, you know, we're just hoping it works. So if we don't have the data, we need to get it. Now, just starting out, when we first define the process, maybe we don't have the data. And if it's something that's happening, you know, many times a day, well, we're going to get lots of data quickly. But if it's something that happens once a week, you know, maybe once a month, then it's going to take a while to get data. Now, if you're doing, there is a thing I'd encourage you to all to find out more about, and you can do that on my website. There's a paper called Signals in the Noise, but there's a wonderful tool called a process behavior chart, or you might also know it as an XMR chart. And you might be surprised to discover that 5 data points would enable you to give some prediction about performance. So we do need some performance, but you know, if it happens once a week, that's 5 weeks worth of data you need before you can do too much. So it might just be, while you don't have enough data, you've got a, I don't know, best guess. Ask the stakeholders, what do you think? If we don't know how long something takes, then find 5 people and ask them who know about the process, who are involved in it, and ask them what they think it is, what the range is. And now we've got some data. We can at least start working on that. We know it's very interim and it's a kind of baseline that might turn out to be a bit dodgy, but at least we can start, because we can't just wait forever. Here's a nice question. Is your book sufficient to work on improving processes in my organisation? Well, yes, of course, my book will fix everything. I think reimagining management's a good start. But to be honest, if you went to my website, to the resources page that Mozza has pointed you towards, there's lots of papers there. I've been writing columns at BP Trends for, gosh, I don't know, 15 years or something. I also write a column regularly for the Business Rules Journal, and you'll find links to those 2 websites there, and all of pretty much everything I've ever written is on those sites for free. But and of course, Process Provocations is free as well. But the book that pulls it all together is Reimagining Management, and a few people should buy that at least, so I can pay my bills. Okay, plenty of questions. Once we are making process, to which level to describe the process will we describe the task level for the employee? So Haith's question is about how do we know we've got enough details for the process? Sorry, Haitham, I've misread. How do we know we've got enough details for the process? Because we could spend our life, as I said, analysing the current state, couldn't we? We could detail everything. We could go down and down and down, more and more detail. We can collect lots and lots of data. So I think firstly, when we're doing process improvement, we need to know which process we're talking about, where it starts and where it finishes. And for any process at any level, if we have good KPIs, good data, and we can make nice assessments of what the performance is and should be and could be, if we can assess the process at that level as working okay, then it's reasonable to assume that its sub-processes are okay. But if, Haitham asked the question about should we dig right down to sort of task level, well, you would if that's where the problem is. If you're trying to fix a problem at task level, then that's where you need to go. So we're always going to drill down to whatever level we need to. What's the problem we're trying to fix is a very good question to ask all the time in our process analysis and improvement. So Mona asked a question here, is there any real benefits of ISO certification for an organisation? Let me answer that in 2 ways. I think there's very little benefit in having a certificate framed and hanging on the wall if that's all you've done. And sometimes it feels a bit like that. You find yourself in ISO certified or EFQM certified organizations or any such certifications, and lots of pictures, lots of certificates hanging on the wall, but things still don't seem to work very well. But let's assume that we're serious about it. If you want to get ISO certified or EFQM certified or any business excellence certification, invariably these days what that requires is that you have a good understanding of your business processes, how they work, how they could work, how they should work, how they are working. You need all of the things that we've been talking about. That's what excellence and quality certification means these days. So I don't think it's not a separate thing. I think quality and business excellence certification is a very useful consequence of good process-based management. That's how I look at it. So it's worth doing, but if all you're doing is looking to get some new stuff to hang on the wall, then there are easier ways to do it. Mona, again, thank you for your questions, Mona. What should we focus on when we want to study the organisation current state? Which tools should we use? Well, there are lots of tools, of course, isn't it? And there's the good set of tools is in SprintPip. So you can find some definition of that, what's there. But, you know, I think what we really need to understand, mostly, whatever tools we're using, what we really need to understand in the as is who are the stakeholders, why they're stakeholders, and what are they experiencing, and what do they want, and how close are we? What are the consequences of any problems we're finding? You know, I don't think you could analyze any process and find that it had no problems. There's always some performance gap, isn't there? But then what's the impact of that gap? What would be the impact of closing the gap? What would be the impact of not closing the gap? What would be the benefit? What would be the cost? You know, is it just a problem that people complain about? But it's, you know, okay, be nice to fix. But sometimes when you get to the end of the 2B process and we've made the recommendations and those changes don't get done, it's because they were kind of, yeah, that would be nice, but there's no compelling reason to do it, you know. We just thought, okay, well, yeah, that'd be nice. We could do that. We could make that a little bit better, but nobody cares enough to do it. You know, we're happy to live with the problem. So yeah, I think whatever helps us to get a deep understanding of the process and what's there. So another question about how can I know the KPIs for any process? Now, I think this is pretty simple. And I also think lots of people make it really, really difficult. And I don't know why you'd want to do that. Firstly, I know why, you know, we identify, say, 200, that's 300 processes in an architecture, whatever it is. And there is a tendency to say, okay, now let's define the KPIs for every one of those. I call this KPI disease. I think there is some point in looking at all of those processes and saying, how would we measure them? You know, an initial look, because that gives you some sense of whether you've defined the process properly and, you know, how should it perform. So some general sense of KPI is good. It's a nice test. But serious development of KPIs and definitions and targets and all of that, you only need to do that for processes that you're actually going to actively manage. You know, maybe it's those 30 high impact processes. There's no point in doing detailed KPI development for hundreds of processes when what you're really going to do is ignore the data, because you can't manage hundreds of processes, right? Okay, so let's, again, focus. Let's make sure we're looking at just that subset of processes. Now, for a particular process, this is the real question, for a particular process, how do we know what the KPIs are? I ask this simple question. If this process was working as well as it should be for the individual stakeholders, what would it be doing and how would we know? And that's not a question as a process practitioner, we just sit in the corner and think about ourselves. They're questions we need to ask the stakeholders. So, you know, if this process was working as well as you want it to be, if we had wiggle happening here, what would be happening and how would we know? What is really important? And that's the conversation starter, and you just keep talking around that. And then you want to get rid of the duplicates, you know, you want to make sure you've got the critical few measures. Sometimes that's just one KPI, you know, but maybe it's 2 or 3. Maybe you could convince me it's 4 or 5. I'd be nervous if it was much more than that. You know, we need whatever measures we need, but we don't need to have 20 or 30. It's never that. You know, that's not analysis. That's just typing. That's just making a list of everything we can think of. So we really want to bring it down to the critical few KPIs and targets. So I think it's just that question, you know, what do you want this process to do? Sometimes there's a regulatory requirement. Sometimes other people are saying, this is what you must do. Okay, well, that makes it easier. But, you know, talk to the people who are in the process and say, who own the process, who make decisions about it. What do you want it to happen? Okay, probably a last question, because we've only got a couple of minutes left. What's the first thing to do for any new BPMO, Business Process Management Office at any organization? The first thing to do, gosh, the first thing, there's lots of first things, aren't there? I think the most important thing that you need to keep in mind as a business process management office is that your job is to raise the capability of the rest of the organisation. It's the kind of philosophical view that you need to bring to your work. It's not your job to do all the process work. Now, in the early days, really, if you have just been established and process work is just starting in the organisation, obviously you're going to do a lot. But if you build an office of BPM so that it's got to be involved in every bit of process work, then what you're going to do is just create a bottleneck, aren't you? You'll end up building the office for the prevention of process improvement. So you need to bring that kind of philosophy to work. You're going to say, how are we going to raise the capability across the organisation so everyone's able to do good process work? How are we going to do that? How do we approach that? How are we going to transition from this period now when we're doing most of the work to a period when others are doing most of the work, others outside the group? That's very important. We've got to plan that. We've got to make it happen. It might take a while. And of course, the other thing that a process office needs to be doing is to be managing, measuring, improving its own processes. If the Office of BPM is not a great example of process-based management, then why would anyone else care? You have to be able to demonstrate that you actually believe in all of the stuff that you're talking about, not just telling other people to get their act together. I think I've exhausted your questions. I'm sorry if I've missed any, but we'll collect those and I'll make sure I collect them. So I think, my friends, this is we're just coming up to the end of our time together. I've really enjoyed this. Thank you for sharing this time with me. I hope you found the comments to be useful. I've certainly enjoyed your questions. You're thinking very well about process, so that's a good sign. I've been traveling to your kingdom for 13 years, but not at all in the last year. But, we're hoping sometime through 2021 that those problems might be behind us, and I might be back in Riyadh, inshallah. Thank you for your time. Shukran.